Welcome to episode 46 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. Do you remember your first year of teaching? Actually, let's take a step back. Do you remember student teaching? Do you remember feeling confident that you were finally, almost a full-fledged licensed teacher? When you got hired for that first job, were you feeling pretty good? I know I was. Even as you prepped your room for the first time, I'm guessing that you, much like I, was ready to inspire the world that walked through your door. Then, if you were anything like me, as the first day of school drew near, you felt a small pit growing in your stomach. If you're lucky, that pit didn't actually start until students arrived. Either way, you realized there was a whole lot more still to learn. I can still remember my first day when all these first graders walked in looking at me, and I thought, oh man, this is it. Of course, I didn't know if that was a this is it good or this is it bad. Thankfully, it was a this is it good. And also, let's be thankful that the educating family trio of Todd Whitaker and daughters Madeline Good and Katherine Whitaker realized that first-year teachers may need a guidebook. They co-authored the best-selling book, Your First Year: How to Survive and Thrive as a New Teacher. What is amazing about this book is that I've read it multiple times now, well past my first year, and I still benefit immensely from it. So today, I've invited Katherine Whitaker onto Anchored in Education to talk more about this amazing book. And I'm fairly certain that she is going to give us some food for thought for educators at all levels. Katherine, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, probably not as excited as I am to have you on to talk about the book Your First Year that you've co-authored with your father and your sister. But before we get to that, we would like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
So my parents are both in education. So a lot of people assume like, oh, your parents are educators, so you wanted to be one as well. I definitely didn't. I saw what they were doing, and yes, and I was like, I don't want to be that. I want to do something different. And then I got to college, and I was just trying to figure things out. And I thought like to myself, what makes me happiest? Like, when am I feeling fulfilled? And I was like, well, I just like working with people. Like, I genuinely like working with people. Okay. So I was like nursing. And then I was like, no, I can't do blood.
Yeah.
And then I genuinely thought about social work and still kind of do, but I'm so sensitive. I didn't think I would be able to handle it like emotionally.
Sure.
So then literally like my second semester of freshman year, I was like, oh my gosh, I think I'm supposed to be a teacher.
The realization hit.
Yeah. And I was like, everything I've been avoiding my whole life, like, here it is. And I'm so happy that this is where I've fallen, because it's filled this piece of me that I didn't even know was empty.
And so, knowing your mom and dad, they would have supported whichever direction you wanted to go. But whenever you finally came to that realization, like, this is where I need to be, were they excited?
Oh, they were so excited. And I think a lot of people were surprised, because my parents know how hard education is right now.
Yeah.
And my parents have both just said, but if our daughters are going into education, then that means this many more students are going to be educated to a phenomenal capacity. So like, why would I discourage that, society moving forward?
Yeah. That's a great way to look at that. And so now you are teaching what and where?
So I'm teaching high school math. I live in Kansas City, Missouri. So I taught 3 years at the middle school level, teaching 8th graders. And now this is my 5th year at the high school level, teaching math. So I've taught 8 years overall. I'm in the midst of my 8th year.
All right. And the book we're talking about today is called
Mhm.
Your First Year: How to Survive and Thrive as a New Teacher. And so
Yes.
that first year of teaching, it's exciting. But
Yes.
right, so it is exciting, but it can quickly become overwhelming. And I feel like this book can serve as sort of a guide, let's say, to preparing in addition to surviving and thriving as a new teacher. So you begin with talking about what to do before the students arrive. So, can you run through some of the crucial parts of preparing before the students show up on day one?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that I kind of want to put out there, because I think everybody who listens to podcasts or educational things thinks that everybody was an expert and like phenomenal from day one. I wrote this book because my first year was terrible.
Okay.
And I wrote this book because I didn't know what to do. Like I didn't know what to do before the school year started. And then I didn't know what to do during the school year when things were hitting the fan.
Yeah.
And so I wrote this after my third year of teaching because I finally had started to figure things out. And so literally I love this book because I wish I had had it. And I wish I would have known what to do in like preparing. I remember the week before school started, my assistant principal came in and he was like, "Your room looks really great. Are you ready for the first day of school?" And I was like, "I don't know." And he was like, "What do you mean?" And I was like, "I mean, I have the lesson, but like, I don't know what to do when kids walk in. I don't know what to do. Like, how do I get them to start? Are they all just going to have their pencils out? Do I need to have pencils ready? Like, I don't know what to do."
Yeah.
And so that's why I love like this preparation part because I remember sitting there thinking, I don't know what to do. And so we're trying to help you think about what to do before they show up. And so the biggest thing for me is I think teachers need to sit and think through the first 5 minutes of class. What do you want it to look like? And then how do you make that happen? So if you want a student to have pencil like on their desk, do you say it? Do you have a picture on the board that also emphasizes that that's what you want? Do you have directions written on the board? Like, how do you get across to your students what your expectations are so that you can have them meet them, but also redirect them if they don't?
Yeah, and it's none of this happens on its own,
No. And I thought it did, and I was wrong.
and that is exactly what we're talking about. And page 9 has a great list. Like, I remember in my first couple years, especially that first year, that the Kleenexes, and that's the first thing that's on this list.
Yes.
We think about this, that it's very simple. We need a Kleenex, we get up and we get a Kleenex. But if you don't have something established in your classroom, something as simple as a Kleenex, a runny nose, a sneeze, it can really kind of derail for the
Mhm.
next 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah. I remember sitting with my sister and we were making this list together. And I was like, and she was like, "Catherine, think back to your first year. What were all the things that your kids were doing that you didn't want them to do?" And I was like, "They couldn't get a Kleenex correctly. They couldn't ask questions the way I wanted them to ask questions. They didn't know how to check books out. I didn't know if they were allowed to eat in my classroom or not in my classroom. And then how do I address that?" And literally that list comes from me sitting and thinking about all the things that just did not go right because I didn't know that I needed to put those procedures in place.
Absolutely. And
Yeah,
that is, I mean, I remember the first time that we lined up at the door and I looked and I thought, this is not right.
I know.
And that's what I love about your first year. I mean, not only do you have three practitioner authors here, but you share personal insights of what you have experienced in classrooms and still
Yes.
experiencing. And this
Yes.
you read this book and it's not going to fix things automatically, but it's going to get you thinking.
Yes. And I think that's the point of both of the books we've written. And we try to be clear about there is no fix. If there was a fix, there wouldn't, like everyone would be doing it. And instead, it's about how do you start reflecting as a practitioner and making the changes that need to happen because that's all that you can do. is reflect on your practice and then figure out how to fix whatever's not working. It's up to you. And that's, I think, what's so hard about this job.
Oh, you've got that right. And
Hmm.
before we go on, I do want to point out that even though it's called Your First Year, I have read this book multiple times now, and
Hmm.
never once during my first year because it wasn't out then. And so,
Hmm.
but I still read it and I still pull things from it. But even if you're a veteran educator, you can read this because it may give you the tools to help maybe, if not your class, one of those newer teachers that you see struggling.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's so important for administrators to read this because I think you forget how what the first year can look like.
Yeah.
Because by the time you become a principal, usually teaching's so instinctual. And so I think it's just you forget all the little nuances that come with that first year because I think the toughest part about preparing is the fact you don't know anything about the personalities that are going to be stepping into the room. You don't know what their dynamic with each other is going to be. And so much of those first few weeks are just working through personalities and then trying to figure out what structures each class needs and each student needs, whether you're elementary or middle or high school.
Yeah, and we have to remember because education is so exciting that the needs of your students in your second year are not going to be the same as the needs of your students from your first year, and so you may just want to
Absolutely.
reread this every year.
I mean, genuinely, absolutely, because it's just going to change every year. You think you figured it out one year, and then, I mean, like I was telling you earlier, my eighth year has been so difficult because of some changes building wide. And so it's like, oh my gosh, I feel like a second or third year teacher again?
Absolutely. So, probably one of the biggest aspects of preparation is the classroom management, and you actually kind of alluded this to the other book that you all have written, Classroom
Hmm.
Management from the Ground Up. We had your sister Madeline join us on Anchored in Education a while back, and she talked about that. So we won't go into classroom management. I thought instead we could talk about one of the next most important things, which is lesson planning. So
Yes.
I appreciated page 39 that said focus on the how instead of the what for teaching. Would you care
Mhm.
to talk about this a bit more?
Sure. So I just feel like what you're teaching can be delivered in a variety of ways. And I think that's sometimes more crucial than necessarily the topic that needs to be discussed. So, as a teacher, you need to decide which way is going to be the most beneficial to you and your students. And how you deliver material is just so crucial to student learning. So, one of the things that I do as a math teacher is I decide how to deliver material based on entry points for students. If I feel like there isn't a clear and safe entry point for every student, depending on what we're working with, if I'm looking at what I have to teach that day and I'm like, oh, there's nothing that I can like pull from their past that will help build to whatever we have to learn today, then I'm probably just going to have to do some direct instruction. And there's nothing wrong with that. Direct instruction can be phenomenal if it's done the correct way. But a lot of times people think you shouldn't do direct instruction or lecture is bad, but sometimes you need to. And I think you have to think about what you're teaching and if that method is appropriate or not.
And I think also what we have to remember with lesson plan, and this still goes back to kind of what we were talking about with the beginning of the book, and it's neat to watch how this book ties everything together. But
Hmm.
that with the lesson planning, one of my biggest things, this all came back to me almost like a picture show in my mind while reading, is the first lesson that I taught and I finished,
Hmm.
and it finished way before I had planned,
Oh, yeah.
and I had nothing to go after that. And so I mean that isn't that part of our lesson planning and knowing what how to lengthen it out to cover our time, but then also what we do to establish if it finishes early or runs long.
Absolutely. And I try to lean on the side of overplan. But if you can't or you think you've overplanned and you're like, oh my gosh, my kids really caught on to this, or wow, they flew through this today. It's always just nice to have something in your back pocket. And so I love like online like quiz games and things. So like Kahoot is
Oh yeah.
awesome. There's something called quizzes, which is awesome. And literally you just type in whatever you were teaching and you can find a bunch of questions about it and just throw it up on the board and have kids get whiteboards and do it, or they can get out their laptops and do it. I mean, and that can, kill a good 10, 15 minutes at the end of the hour if you need it. And just knowing things like that, so if you do get in that moment and it does feel like crunch time, it doesn't have to be.
Sure. All right. So the procedures and lesson planning, that kind of wraps up section 1. Section 2 we talked about was the management side that we've covered. So we'll move to section 3, which is working with adults. And so I love that this is included. Sometimes the biggest challenges in education are not students, but rather the adults. So we're talking other teachers, support staff, administrators, parents, and I guarantee you the veteran educators listening right now, they're all nodding their head, and we're letting everyone else know that this is absolutely true. So can we start with the quote? It's much easier to criticize a leader than it is to be one.
Yes. So I want to start kind of with teaching first.
Yeah.
I just truly believe that no one understands the job of a teacher until you become one. There's no way. Even student teaching, you don't understand the nuances that are going to come with teaching and being in the classroom and being the lead of a classroom.
Uh-huh.
And so therefore no one can really truly understand the job of a leader or a principal again until you become one. So many people are willing to criticize principals, but we do not understand all the moving parts within a school. And I think it's really hard for teachers, new and veteran, to think outside of their classroom. Like there's times when I can't think outside of my classroom. And so I know it's got to be hard for other people. And the principal has to think about the school as a whole. And you're thinking about the 30 students in your room. And it's just so different.
It most definitely is. And I kind of laughed. I made a little note on the student teaching because I thought I was an outstanding educator in student teaching because that class was always in control
Yep.
and everything was down. And then it didn't dawn on me until I took over my own room that it was because there was a teacher in there that was assisting in that control, and a veteran teacher. So,
Yep.
but you're absolutely right, and that there are so many working parts, and even so, we criticize a principal not knowing that they're looking on a whole, but then we work across the hall, or we work in teams, whether it's grade level or subject level, and it's easy to see what they're doing and criticize that. But we have to understand that what's working in their room may not be working in ours, or vice versa.
Right.
Another amazing quote from this section comes from the chapter about parents. And so, for starters, parents should be friends, not foes. And I think that's so important. And this is the best week for me to even reread that. Even difficult parents, we need to work the best we can together with them for the overall success of the student. So let's talk more about the quote I'd like to talk about, or what I'd like to talk about is the quote, the best they know how is maybe not the best you know how. And again, we're talking parents.
I think the thing that's hard for teachers is we need to keep in mind that a parent is never, ever trying to raise a quote unquote bad child.
Right.
Ever. They love their child. They want their child to be happy. They want their child to find success. It's just their way of attempting to make that happen is potentially different than how we were raised, how you potentially are raising your children, or honestly just different than anything you've ever seen before, like whether it be how your friends grew up, etc. And just the thing that every teacher needs to remember is that you can find common ground with parents because you both have the same goal for their child, and
Yes.
that's for them to be successful.
It is. And a lot of times, like you said, the path to that success differs, but you have to find a way to get those paths to converge.
Yes. And I think if a parent knows that you care about their kid, I mean, you can't ever care about a child as much as a parent does, but if you're at least coming close and you can list a bunch of positive attributes that this child has, and then talk about, I'm seeing this, but and then come up with strategies for how to fix those things, and you're just not like, fix your kid, this isn't working, because they're going to say the same at you. You're in charge of the classroom, you need to fix my kid. And if you are battling each other, the child's in the middle and there's never going to be success.
That is true. And, one of those one of those magic things you can say to a parent, and it may not immediately fix it, but it's going to help you as an educator, is to let them know that you hear them and that you understand. And
Mhm.
it is absolutely okay to say with a parent that you respectively you can't agree, but
Yeah.
you can agree to disagree, and we can find, like you said, that common ground.
Absolutely.
All right, so section 4, it starts talking about reflecting, refining, and growing on your journey. And
Yeah.
so some of the best advice was about being observed. And I think this is an often ignored piece of advice that could be the biggest benefactor to improving our craft. So, this advice should be taken in by new, novice, and veteran teachers. So, let's talk about how we can get educators to see the value in being observed instead of trying to teach in a silo.
I think the reason teachers turn away from observations is because they're usually linked to evaluations, which is a bummer. But if there's any way to get an administrator in your room, or a teaching and learning coach in your room, or a peer teacher in your room to be observed in a non-evaluative way, it can be so beneficial. I mean, just like unbelievably beneficial. I'll never forget my principal, my very, very first year of teaching. She observed me, and I don't remember the whole observation because I know it was like an hour that we debriefed afterwards, but she told me two things that I'll never forget. She told me that I talk too fast and that I stand in one place.
Oh, really?
Yes. And I didn't realize that I talked too fast. No one had ever told me that, but it makes sense looking at my father.
Yeah.
And then I just was totally unaware that while I was teaching, I was standing in one place. But she made me realize that I was just tied to the board at the front doing all my work up there. And it made me think, well, like, okay, well, how do I get not tied to the front? And I realized I needed to think about, like, oh, maybe I should be taking breaks as I show work, and maybe I should step back and then, ask a kid, what do you think the next step is? And maybe have them go up and put it on the board. And just her saying those two things to me, that I talk too fast and that I stand in one place, made me think, okay, well, obviously I need to slow down. And then two, I need to be creative about how to get out of the front of the room. Like, how can I change my teaching practice so that that doesn't happen? And the big thing that we talk about also in the book is tweaks and resets.
Yes.
And I talk about resets a lot because I had to do one, and I'm very passionate about resets, and I want teachers to be able to know they can do that. And the biggest way to reset is to have people come and observe and help you pinpoint what's wrong. Like, what is going on? What is wrong in my classroom? And the thing that's hard about that is teachers have to be vulnerable enough to allow someone to come in there and critique them, which is so scary. But the benefits outweigh the scariness, in my opinion. So you kind of just have to bite the bullet.
Well, absolutely, and I second that opinion. And
Yeah.
and going back, you're right. The observation with the tied and linked to the evaluation, it's not so much, in my opinion, that is the problem. It's that we have made evaluation be such a punitive thing that
Yes.
then it links back to, then observation is something that is associated with negative. But like you said, if you open yourself up to be observed, and people can point out things, and I know that there are many things that I have had to fix myself with,
Hmm.
whether it be my speaking or even my listening, and working on these things. But you need somebody to come in and tell you that. And I share with my teachers in my district as often as I can that I had an evaluation one year when I was teaching, and it was a math lesson, and it was not going well. And so I met with my principal afterwards, and she asked me a very simple question. She goes, "In your opinion, how was that lesson?"
Hmm.
And I said, "I really think that it tanked. It was not good." And she said, "Well, I agree." And
Hmm.
so from there, you have a decision on what to do as a principal. But what she said is, she said, "I would like to come in tomorrow because you're going to tell me now what you're going to do."
Mhm.
And it wasn't punitive. We talked through, she saw so many things that was going on. She's like, you had a student in the back that was doing it, and you never used him as a resource or to show, to demonstrate. I mean, there were so many things that I could do to make that lesson successful. She said, I'm going to come back and you're going to teach it again tomorrow, and we're going to see how it goes. And it was so wonderful. But
Yeah.
it was being open. You've got to be open, like you said, to that advice. But it doesn't have to be a principal. Mine was for evaluation, but it can be a colleague that you trust. You could have a pineapple chart in like a lounge where you can sign up and have people come in. I know that's something that's been tossed around in my district. So,
Mhm.
but you give such great ideas on that. So before we go, Catherine, purchasing the book comes with e-resources, which include 2 free study guides, one for practicing teachers and one for student teachers. Can you talk a little bit more about these resources?
Yes, I have talked to a lot of school districts and realized through college classes that they've been using these as like study materials and talking points. So a lot of times districts will post on Twitter and like tag my sister, or dad, and I, so we can see that they're using the material.
Yeah.
But for first and second year teacher groups, they have used them to facilitate discussions about things happening inside and outside of the classroom, to kind of start those tough conversations or help people be vulnerable about things that are going on so that they can start to problem solve. And then for student teachers, professors have used them to help students think about teaching in a broader spectrum. I think a lot of times as a student teacher, you don't realize what is about to come at you. And so I think the study guides are helpful with that. And I just think the biggest piece of it all is teaching is about constant reflection and
Yes.
adjustments. And so the study guides, they help you start that crucial process in order to be a successful instructor.
Yes, and if you want to join kind of the Twitter conversation, you can tweet out hashtag your first year, and
Absolutely.
I know that's one way that several have connected with you and your co-authors. But the book is Your First Year. I'm going to put a link to this book on my website so others can get to it, and it will just be, I think it should be on every professional bookshelf across the rooms in the United States. So, Catherine, I appreciate you taking the time and joining us on Anchored in Education today.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Now, you can find Catherine on Twitter by searching at Miss Whitaker 294, and you can also read more about her as well as find a link to Your First Year on my website, escottengland.com. Before I wrap up today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. So I cannot help but reiterate that this book is for everyone. Now, I'm not sure if you remember Catherine mentioning something about this year, her 8th year being challenging. In a conversation before our interview, she had mentioned the changes in her district that has led her year to be more like a whirlwind. It isn't that the changes are bad changes, it is just unlearning old routines as new ones are put in place. But she is utilizing the same strategies and suggestions from your first year in order to be successful in her 8th year. And think back to a few episodes ago when Amy Reed was a guest on Anchored in Education. You remember, Amy is the teacher who has made several changes of grade and subject levels over her 15 years. Plus, this year, her 15th year of teaching, she is tackling science for the first time, as well as 7th grade. This is another great example of someone who is essentially experiencing that first year at year 15. Sometimes we just need to be reminded of how we can stay ahead in this profession. What we do is highly rewarding, but like Catherine said, if you haven't walked the halls in a teacher's shoes, then you don't quite understand. Too many times we are inundated with the research of beginning teachers leaving the profession before they even complete 5 years. So, how many of these exiting teachers are actually high quality teachers who have just become overwhelmed? I would venture a guess that it is the majority. We cannot afford to lose good teachers. So even if you are a veteran teacher, a teacher of the year, or some other highly decorated educator, pick up your copy of Your First Year. First, read it, and then give it to a new teacher as a gift. Let them know that you understand it can be challenging, but that we are there for one another. Sometimes that is all we need to hear, because at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.